So, today we're going to talk about the openings of 3 dance movies. All That Jazz from 1979, directed by Bob Fosse. Staying Alive from 1983, directed by Sylvester Stallone. And A Chorus Line from 1985, directed by Richard Attenborough. So these 3 movies have some things in common. They're all centered around dance. They're all kind of backstage musicals. All That Jazz is a completely different creature, but among its other things, it's a backstage musical. Aside from that, the way that they do camera work could not be more different. We have one incredibly talented director, Bob Fosse. We have one director who's very good at other things, but is kind of in the wrong genre here, and that's Richard Attenborough. And then we have one director who kind of doesn't know that directing dance movies is a thing that needs a specific skill set. The openings of all 3 of these movies are available on YouTube, and I will link them below for your reference. I would recommend watching all 3 of them all the way through. Beware when you click on the Staying Alive sequence. Get ready for how it happens, because the music is really loud and very sudden. Okay, so here we've got the opening of All That Jazz. We start with the cattle call. The cattle call is when you bring in all the dancers, you make them all dance together, and then you slowly whittle down until you have your cast. All That Jazz kind of typifies this scene. First, we have the dancers coming in and kind of what they do to prepare and so on, and then we get into the audition proper. This first master wide shot that you see that zooms out is a pretty standard angle, but there's a lot of information in it. Right there, you see Roy Scheider, who is Bob Fosse's alter ego in this film. He's moving his arm, it's his left arm, and later on in the film he's going to have a heart attack. Here is the moment where you see like the groundwork laid for that in this shot. You also see next to him he's got cigarettes, he's got coffee. The point is there's a lot of information about the main character in this shot, even though he's crouched on the stage and very small compared to the scope of the shot. As we start to winnow down the crowd, the way that we're taken through this process is with incredibly fast editing and so many angles. In this day and age, getting a bunch of different angles is fairly easy because the cameras are smaller and you can move them around, especially with a digital setup. But in 1979, the cameras were huge and you had a sort of limited resources for how you were going to set them up, which is why each day of shooting has a certain limited number of setups, which are sort of specific angles where you're going to put the camera and capture the action from. And there are so many angles in this sequence, I can't even imagine how many days they must have spent on the stage shooting this sequence, because there are just so many. If this were a more professional video series, I would probably count them, or like count the edits in the sequence. You're welcome to, please feel free, but I'm not going to. In the sequence, we move on, we see the dancers, we see them from many different angles. There's one particular angle that I just can't get enough of. It's this. Oh, I love it. I love it. It's not as informational as some of the other shots, but man, it's gorgeous. From here, we move on to the auditions becoming more individual. So they sing, the various actors, and then eventually the music, the on-Broadway, stops, and the Fosse character starts interviewing them. So that's the opening of All That Jazz. I have summarized it down to a nub because there's a lot more to cover with the other 2 films. Whew, this movie, if you haven't seen it, it's something else. The next film on the list is Staying Alive, one of my favorite bad movies. I really love to put it on and yell at it. Directed by Sylvester Stallone, it is the official sequel to Saturday Night Fever. Whether it is also a spiritual sequel to Saturday Night Fever, I don't think so. There's a long essay in my forthcoming book, Junk Film, about this movie and Showgirls, which have a lot in common. They've both got main characters who are weirdly unlikable. They're both dance movies. There's a lot of similarity between them. But in the course of writing this essay, I started thinking about how the opening sequence of Staying Alive is an amazingly poor recreation of the opening sequence of All That Jazz. It's also an audition scene. The whole thing is staged similarly, even down to the actors wearing similar kind of workout gear. However, if you look at the opening sequence of Staying Alive, you will see a lot of medium shots, a lot of rapid cutting that doesn't offer you gracefulness or information. It's meant to show us frenetic dancing, but it does not succeed at that. All it does is kind of show us bits and pieces of the human body. This sequence is also supposed to tell a story. It's supposed to show us how Tony Manero comes to this audition. At first he tries to stay in line and dance better than everybody else, but then he does this thing where he breaks away from the crowd and does a solo. But because the angle is from over here and we just sort of see him do his thing, but we don't see what the rest of the group is doing, the story doesn't come off the first time you see the film. The angles for this sequence are very straightforward. There's not a lot of like diagonals going on. There's a lot of medium shots, like I said, of sort of waist to head, but it's also really disorganized, and it doesn't give us a sense of the whole landscape of the audition, nor of the process of slowly winnowing down bit by bit, which is what All That Jazz did. Because this whole sequence is shot without information as the front and center goal of where to put the camera and how to move it, there's not a lot of information in these sequences. There's also not a lot of grace in human movement, which is definitely part of the All That Jazz sequence. Staying Alive is meant to mimic All That Jazz, but the mimicking isn't successful because not only is it not as artistically sound, but Stallone doesn't understand how to shoot dance on film and also what the point of the All That Jazz sequence was. He doesn't know how to dazzle with the camera and with editing techniques, but he also doesn't understand kind of what it is to be on the stage to try out for a part. And that brings us to A Chorus Line, which was made in 1985. I'm not quite sure what the influence situation is here because the film is based on a stage play from 1975, so it's impossible that it would have been inspired by All That Jazz, but I am certain that Richard Attenborough saw All That Jazz. Whether he saw Staying Alive, doubtful. What happens in this sequence, the camera is in with the dancers, which is not really the case in either of the movies that we saw so far. It's at human level, it weaves in between the dancers. It doesn't take the bird's eye view until later in the sequence. And you can tell that the change is coming because you can see Michael Douglas reflected in the mirrors at the back of the stage. And then there's this zoom out, and it's the same angle as the shot from All That Jazz, where we have this diagonal angle on the stage. It's actually the same angle that Attenborough uses to shoot the conclusion of A Chorus Line when they're doing the one number. It's this very, very long backward shot, and he's kind of working with Busby Berkeley on that one. Busby Berkeley was a choreographer from the 20s and 30s who did really interesting things with the masses of human bodies that were available at that time from the pool of contract players. The camera does completely different things in A Chorus Line. One of the things that it does is it centers characters who are going to be important later. You can only tell this if you've seen the movie before, but like right in the center of the frame are these various dancers who are going to be main characters in the movie to come. All That Jazz doesn't do this. It just sort of centers random people because we know that the real center of the sequence is Roy Scheider sitting there crouching on the stage worried about his heart attack. Meanwhile, Staying Alive centers Tony again and again. We see other dancers, but they're not as important. And also, there are these weird freeze frames in the Staying Alive sequence where you freeze frame, but it's blurry. And I still can't figure out who thought that that looked good or that it was okay to sort of leave in the film. What the heck? It looks awful. In A Chorus Line, I didn't know when I first watched this movie that the entire thing was the audition process. Whole thing is the audition. It's like 2 hours of these poor dancers having to bare their souls at an audition. And that means that the opening sequence, where they're winnowing down, like in the other two films, serves a different purpose. And that's part of why we see real characters in the shots. And it's part of why the camera stays kind of on stage level. It's because we don't want to do too many tricks with the camera because this is fundamentally a human story. That's not true for All That Jazz, and it wasn't even considered in Staying Alive because Stallone, not a camera guy. He's telling a human story. That is something he's good at. But what the film is about is conveyed with the camera work in the other two movies, and in Staying Alive, it's just not. This is, again, why if you're going to imitate something, you need to understand what it's doing before you just replicate it. That's the deal with these three movies and their opening sequences. I really hope you watch All That Jazz. It is messy. It's a messy masterpiece, which is my favorite kind. I also hope you watch Staying Alive, because it is a terrible movie. If you want to know more about why I love to yell at it, you're going to have to wait until May 2023 when my book Junk Film comes out. Hope to see you again.
It's showtime, folks.